Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Come on in the room, as they say. We are so excited to have everyone here as a part of our Hunt Institute Race and Education webinar for February. Our topic today is the impact of cultural centers on BIPOC student experiences. So we will give folks another minute or so to get in, and I will pass it off to Dr. Canty to get us started in just a minute. Welcome. All right, Dr. Canty, we've got a good amount of folks in the room. We are also streaming live on Facebook. For those of you who would like to view the webinar from that platform, it is available there as well on the Hunt Institute page. I will now pass it over to Dr. Ashley Canty, who is the Director of Equity Initiatives at the Hunt Institute.
Thank you so much, Sherelle. I'm so excited to be here with you all today and our wonderful panelist and moderator. This webinar will be focused on the impact of cultural centers on the BIPOC student experience. The Hunt Institute is committed to having honest conversations about issues of race that are embedded and impact all of public education. We view all of our programs through an equity lens, and the Race and Education webinar series is another opportunity to lift up the voices of the people and organizations who have dedicated their time and resources to improving outcomes for children and people of color. Today, we are joined by Dr. Williams, who will be moderating our conversation. I will now turn this over to Dr. Williams, who will introduce himself as well as our wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Dr. Canty. Hello, everyone. My name is D. Williams, and I'm the Senior Editor for Diversity and Inclusion at Best Colleges, and I'm thankful and happy to be joining both Dr. Kadeba and Dr. Noble for today's conversation. Dr. Miriam Kadeba is the Director of Multicultural Student Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Kadeba grew up in Ivory Coast, West Africa. She received her doctoral degree in counseling psychology from the University of Akron, Ohio, and has been working at Virginia Commonwealth since 2016. Dr. Kadeba's areas of interest include, but are not limited to, multiculturalism, advocacy, social justice, international affairs, community building, and mental health. She values helping to empower individuals and communities that hold identities that have been systemically and historically marginalized while promoting wellness, agency, community healing, and thriving. Dr. Roosevelt Noble serves as the Assistant Dean of Residential Colleges, Director of the Black Cultural Center, and Faculty Head of Stambo House. He is a scholar of the American criminal justice system with research focused on racial disparities in incarceration and capital punishment. He is a strong advocate for social justice, as indicated by his engagement as an executive board member for the Tennessee chapter of the ACLU, the Nashville Community Bail Fund, and the Tennessee Innocence Project. Dr. Noble is a proud Vanderbilt alum, having earned his bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degree from Vanderbilt University. Now, as Dr. Canty alluded, today we are talking about the cultural centers and their impact on the BIPOC student experiences. Historically, we know that Black cultural centers emerged at the height of the civil rights movement, when the number of Black college students attending historically white institutions expanded significantly during the 1960s and 1970s. And while these centers have historically served as spaces for identity development, community, and belonging for Black college students, today we still see issues indicative of a hostile racial climate, including lack of representation among faculty and staff, both micro and macro aggressions experienced by BIPOC students, and an imbalance of social and financial resources that would otherwise support their college experience. As colleges and universities seek to reaffirm their commitment to racial equity, this is undoubtedly a timely conversation, and I am happy to be speaking with you both today, Dr. Noble and Dr. Kadeba.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Of course. So let's get this party started. So I have the first question for you both is, in your view, what assets have cultural centers imparted on campus since their inception?
I'll start us off with this one. I think from my perspective, when we think about the assets of what's added, you got obviously student support and development. I believe also, as you mentioned in your intro, identity development, which I think is very, very crucial. I think we also play a huge part in the lane of creating a sense of community and belonging at PWIs, or historically white institutions. Recruitment and retention. We do a phenomenal job as far as helping not only the folks who are there to stay and matriculate all the way through, but also in recruiting and enticing other students to consider our particular institutions. I believe it's also a place and space for education of the broader campus community. I'll be completely honest and say that of all of the components of what I think is important, that's the one that I value the least, because I don't think it's our responsibility to educate the masses. And so while that's a function and an asset, it's not necessarily something that I'm striving to do, which is case in point why I don't even advertise our Black History Month events to our masses. I have a special listserv, and I send it to these folks on this listserv. I also believe it's about community engagement with, say, our underserved and marginalized communities within our respective cities and locations. We become kind of the main connector between some of our communities that we serve. I believe we also support the academic mission of the institution. There's programs that we do, especially as our institution, we're doing a lot around immersion and immersion projects, where we have a very special immersion project we created where it's all about Black history, where we take students to study the Black history in different cities that fits in line with that. Faculty engagement, that's another one of our crucial purposes that we serve. And for us, one of the things that we did about 2 years ago is we started a Black Faculty and Staff Association that's housed within our Black Cultural Center. And so everything that I basically just mentioned in terms of what we can add for the students is also something that applies for faculty and staff as well. So we've seen dividends as far as recruitment and retention. HR now, anytime we have a new Black employee, I find out about it because I go, hey, you may want to join the association. And that, to me, that speaks to our value. That speaks to the value that we add. And so there's so much that we do, even with professional development in that lane, mentorship in that lane. I have some junior staff members, junior faculty members who come to me. It's like, hey, you've been here 28 years. How do I survive this place? That's something that comes out of having that association. And that's another asset as well. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Dr. Kadeba.
Listen, Dr. Noble, you said everything. You said all the things. The points that I wanted to emphasize based on what you shared was related to that sense of belonging, because I think oftentimes, and particularly recently, I'm hearing a lot of conversations around, we need to help our students with belonging and their sense of persistence on campus, and how I am in a historically like PWI, and a lot of conversation around how we help our students feeling more of a sense of belonging, right? Like this is the role that cultural centers play. They allow students to truly to exhibit that sense of belonging. I think of it oftentimes as like, this is the place where students can go in and then clench their jaw and drop their shoulders. Like, to me, this is what I describe it as. Like, that is the sensation that the centers bring. And not only for students, but also for our faculty, right? And I think another key component as well is it's oftentimes the hub where concerns around that specific population, if we're talking about Black folks, for example, it's oftentimes the place where our concerns are heard and centered. Oftentimes it can be diluted and diffused in so many other ways, in so many other places, right? But really thinking about how cultural centers allow Black students and Black faculty to truly center our experiences and our concerns, and also to ultimately allow us to also celebrate who we are. There's something very joyful around being able to be amongst your kind and feel seen in that way, where you don't necessarily need to explain so many differences that you might be feeling. So I think those are the points that I wanted to emphasize based on what you shared, Dr. Noble.
I wish there was an amen reaction in the Zoom list.
Yeah, yes. A hand raise will work. A hand raise will work for those who are watching this webinar. Thank you both for your perspective. I think, again, talking about that community and that sense of belonging, I think if you have that as your foundation, you're able to build so much on top of it. To Dr. Noble's point of adding on that faculty engagement piece. So now you're impacting recruitment and retention of not just students on campus, but also faculty and administrators. And being in a space where you're able to feel joy and not experience the harsh realities of our world, if even for a moment, even if it's to have lunch with a Black mentor or to engage in important social issues on campus, these spaces are absolutely important. And I appreciate both your responses to that. So I'll go to you next, Dr. Noble. Dr. Noble, the role and purpose of cultural centers has changed, I would say, somewhat, ever so slightly since the 1960s and 1970s. I think the original impetus was for a space for Black students who were far and few, not nearly as many Black college students as we have on campus today, as a means of recruitment and retention and just creating resources that did not exist before at predominantly historically white institutions. So I'm curious, do you believe it has changed for better or worse? And what should be the programmatic focus of these centers going forward?
Yes, thank you for that question. I do believe it has changed, and I believe it's changed for the better. And in our case, I believe is absolutely necessary. Your centers have to be continuously evolving. Our students are continuously evolving. I've been fortunate enough to be on our campus for 28 years and have some very fond memories of engaging with our Black Cultural Center as an undergraduate student. Like my 21st surprise birthday party was thrown in our BCC. I'll never forget that, right? So I have lots of memories about that building. I probated right in front of that building. When I joined Alpha Phi Fraternity Incorporated, it was right there in front of that building. So I have lots of memories, fond attachments to that building. But the interesting thing was, for me, when I look at the totality of the timeline of the history of our center, from unofficially 1972 is when our Black students decided this is going to be our spot. From essentially 1972 to 2003, it was a house. And most of us refer to it as the house. Most alumni refer to it as the house. And it was a very informal structure, largely almost student ran for a good chunk of that time. But it had that grandma's house feel to it. Squeaky floors, sweaty windows when too many people got in there. But we did so much stuff in that little video house, right? Jesse Jackson spoke in that house, Wynton Marsalis played in that house. Anytime somebody significant and Black came to campus, they came to the house. And the programming had to look and feel relatively different. Because at that time, if I'm being honest, even if I go back to when I was there in the mid-1990s, we were about 3% Black students. And a significant proportion of those, especially Black males, were athletes. I was an athlete. And when 75% of Black men in your campus are student athletes, that's a different type of program, that's a different type of diversity. We didn't have as much diversity in what it meant to be Black. The vast majority of our students came from large urban areas. And so we had to change. And so we had a major change that happened in 2004. Our center got renovated and expanded. And when it renovated and expanded, we went from what I call the era of the house to the era of the BCC, the Black Cultural Center. And so a lot of our alums, like when I tell them, for example, they're coming to campus and say, hey, meet me at the BCC, they have no clue what I'm talking about. But the second I say the house, they know exactly what I'm talking about. Because in 2004, our space became way more formal, way more pristine. The artwork, everything about it changed. The university put a lot of money into it. And it kind of developed almost this like museum feel. You take the students out. I've actually had some people ask me, like, hey, can I schedule a tour of y'all museum? Like, this is not a museum. This is a culture. This is a lively space. When I think of museums, I think of like death and pictures on the wall, but not a lot of people in there. I don't think like lively, soul, a lot of energy. And so for us, from 2014 to 2004 to 2017, that was really the era of the BCC to where students were not as engaged with the building. Student attendance was low. The programming didn't necessarily meet the student needs. It wasn't student driven. And then 2017 is when I came along as a director. Having been there for as long as I have been rather, for me, it was important to marry the soul of the house with the modern day functionality and needs of the BCC. So for me, it was about how do I bring back in the energy and the soul of the students, right? I love when we have the students all in the building, but at the same time that they're there, our program looks different now because 20 years ago, we didn't have to deal with gender identity as much. 20 years ago, we didn't have to deal with the fact that I got black students from Wyoming, places I didn't know black people existed. We got black people showing up from. We didn't have to deal with a lot of those things, right? And so, and also 20 years ago, largely everybody fit that like one monolith of blackness, right? Whereas now I got to make sure that, like, no, I have a Caribbean Student Association, I have an African Student Union, and I have a Black Student Association. I got to make sure that this place and space is like what I call hyper intersectional. Like, you got to think about all of the different ways in which your students can kind of carve out their identity, and they got to be able to see and feel themselves in that place and space. And so for us, that's been part of our evolution. Our evolution is how do we make this place and space more modernized to meet the demands and meet the needs of our students. So for example, 2 years ago, we put in gender neutral bathrooms. We converted both of our bathrooms to gender neutral. I know there's some older alums from the 60s and 70s like don't get that concept, but they're not on campus. They don't understand that this is where we are right now, right? And so being able to kind of keep up with the time, so to speak, in that time, I think is important. And so our programming looks and feels different because we went from having, a little house that had 200 students on campus to a Black Cultural Center with about 800 Black students on campus. Programming got to look a little different because you got a lot more diversity and you got a lot bigger population to serve. And so for me, I think programming moving forward for us, at least under my reign, a couple of things, three things I'll touch on here, and I'll stop talking because again, I can go on forever. My class is 3 hours long, so I'm not used to talking in like short spurts. But there's three things specifically that I want to reference as far as like programming moving forward in terms of keeping up with the times. One of the things that I think is more pressing that we got to steer more and more to and tackle dead on is the mental health issues that come with being a Black student on a predominantly white campus. We got to change the cultural narrative within our own community around like mental health is health. We need to make sure that we're having those kinds of conversations for our students realize and understand that, hey, there's resources. We're here to help you through that. Mental health is very important. I think we also got to make sure we're addressing the trauma that our students, the residual trauma that our students experience and bring from outside sources onto our campus. Our campuses don't exist in a vacuum. And so for a professor to assume that, this Chauvin verdict doesn't impact you, you still got to show up and take this test. No, that verdict does impact that student. You should show some accommodation for this student because they don't exist in a vacuum in that regard. Then lastly, I would say, I mentioned this one already, but being hyper intersectional. Like, you got to think about all the ways in which all of the various dynamics of making sure that your students can see and feel themselves, not only in the general culture of the building, but in the staff, in the students. Like, we have a student ambassador program. I'm very intentional about making sure my student ambassadors don't all fit one mold. My student workers don't all fit one mold. Our program doesn't all fit one mold. So you got to be very conscientious of that. So.
That was a whole sermon, and we'll take it, whether it's a short spurt or 3 hours. I also want to definitely highlight what you said. Our universities don't exist in a vacuum, and that's also kind of why I said our centers have slightly changed, given kind of the nature and the impetus for why these cultural centers were created as a mechanism for social and political engagement about issues that impact students, especially those who have to experience racism outside of college campuses. Inevitably, if you see something on the news or an event that just recently happened, that's going to impact the experience. And I think that your center in particular is doing a really good job of baking that into, okay, how can we use this as a learning opportunity? How can we use this as an engagement opportunity? How can we use this to bring people together across the aisle? Dr. Kadeba, I would love to get your take on this, being that you're the director of Multicultural Student Affairs, and I imagine that you serve a multitude of students who have different social identities at different intersections. Do you have any thoughts about whether or not cultural centers have changed for better or worse and the programmatic focus that should be there going forward?
So what I would say is, like, first of all, I echo, second, I share everything that Dr. Noble said, and I was out here taking notes because one, I felt seen and heard. I mean, it's very much a lot of what I've been talking about with colleagues and fellow administrators around the changes that have been taking place and thinking about even the role that I play here at VCU. So VCU does not have a history of having cultural centers, which I think is problematic, quite frankly, because that means that the space in itself has not been present for our students, but our students have been here, which plays into all sorts of like belonging issues and things like that. So I think it's so crucial for us to be able to attend to those things. And Dr. Noble, when you mentioned this sense of, or like really being able to emphasize mental health and the hyper intersectionality, it really spoke to my psychologist heart, because I'm like, that is absolutely key to what it is that we're doing. And when we're talking about mental health, it expands outside of doing individual one-on-one therapy. It expands outside of even group therapy, right? And there's all sort of stigma and things that we can do to break down that stigma. But sometimes being able to even be in community with folks that are able to candidly and willingly share about their experiences with anxiety, with struggling with mental health concerns, it demystifies the system, the process in itself. It doesn't have to be, you have to go to this specific program to learn that. Being in a community that values it, that affirms mental health concerns and needs is so important. And I think that is the role that multicultural centers really need to emphasize as we're moving forward. The other thing that I would say around the hyper intersectionality, thinking about even the VCU student population here, our students, more than a third of our students are housing and food insecure. And that is one of the realities that we have to take into consideration when the students, our Black students, are called to come in and still perform with their classes and do what they need to do when you may not necessarily have had a meal, or you're thinking about some of the ways that you have to slice your meal into 2 or 3 to be able to make it work, right? So the concerns and the needs of our students in this 2022 year have changed, and our cultural centers absolutely have to adjust accordingly.
I want to amen what she said about food insecurities. I want to throw another layer on top of that. Some of our institutions, I think we have this. I'm going to speak candidly about my institution. In some places, there can be this perception that because of who we are as an institution, we shouldn't have food insecurity issues. Like we're somehow above that. But no, when I tell you, we have a food pantry that I stock weekly. And it constantly goes out. So I go to Sam's Club every Sunday and I'm buying food. It ain't just miraculously just disappearing. And I know we have students that were it not for our food pantry, I would seriously worry about how some of our students were eating. So, and those are additional resources that the university doesn't know about or doesn't care a whole lot about, but my alumni population does, because they're the ones who send me the money to make sure I stock it, to make sure I keep it stocked, because they had those same issues when they were in school, kind of thing. So.
Excellent point. Again, it's about those financial resources, and if we're to say that we truly care about the experiences of historically excluded and marginalized students, so a lot of these students come from low socioeconomic status, or they are first-generation college students who don't necessarily have the same resources as their peers on campus. Add on top of that the layer of racial identity, becoming more aware of that, engaging with the issues around that could really impact the college experience. So again, I think that to both of your points, like being cognizant of the multitude of different issues that students are coming into college with, whether it be race or whether it be college affordability, is key and very important to these centers. Dr. Kadeba, I would like to start with you for my next question. Given the current racial climate for BIPOC students and higher education, how would you assess the current level of support for cultural centers in higher education? Which y'all talked a little bit about before, but if you want to go in a little bit more, I won't hate it.
Listen, you yourself actually said something that was spot on around this part, right? Like, because there's all this conversation around what can be done, and oftentimes many of us are faced with the reality that the resources do not align with those conversations, right? So I just want to take even since 2020, right? There's been so many conversations at the university level, but really, I mean, locally, nationally, globally. But I want to focus at the university level around some of the things that we could do to better empower our students, to really transition toward being an anti-racist campus, right? Like, this is one of the words that is oftentimes being utilized. And in so many ways, we get the feedback from students, and I say we because I am an administrator, so I am positioning myself in that realm, right? But we get the feedback from students that are like, so many of those words can seem so performative. It can seem so like y'all are just using the words, but really you're not backing it up. And I'm looking like, facts. Points are being made here. Points are being made. So what like this is just the reality. Students are are saying the truth and they're seeing right through it, right? So if there's the energy and discussion around we need to move towards being an anti-racist institution, and yet the personnel that the university has approved or funded for the Multicultural Center revolves around 4 individuals and a budget of, I oftentimes joke around and say that we are tasked with about 3 people and $7 to be able to serve our entire student population. Go forth and make miracle, Black women. Like, do your thing. And I think this is really boils down to, can the institutions actually align their behavior to the values that they are saying that they're espousing?
Yeah.
Dr. Noble, I know you have a follow-up to that. So I would love your perspective on that one as well.
Yes, I would agree. I think our students sometimes will tell me, when things happen outside of the Vandy bubble that, our administrators feel the need to respond to. It's like, we don't need another statement. Like, I don't need another statement that the university stands on X, Y, and Z. Like, what are we substantively doing to address the issues that we have on our campus? When I think about this work, it's almost interesting because you can put it in the post and pre-George Floyd era. That was a pivotal moment where for some institutions, really post George Floyd became like the wake up call. And I've had conversations with various institutions, I won't name them, about, hey, how do we start a Black Cultural Center? And when I'm interviewing with prospective students and they tell me, hey, I want to go to X, Y, and Z school, I say, hey, we've had one on our campus since 1972 in some capacity. There's a lot of places that are just starting to do this work. You should factor that in when you're thinking about where you want to go to school at. It's easy to kind of pick up and start doing a lot of stuff in the post-George Floyd era, right? But what you really want to do and how you really want to gauge how serious the university is in this lane is, what were they doing before that? What were they doing when the eyes of everybody wasn't necessarily on them and watching them? We also got to deal with the fact that at this day and time, like, our students are asking and demanding a whole lot more now. Their level of activism and being vocal is significantly greater and higher than my generation, or than some of the folks who came even after me. And so we have to be very responsive to that. I joked about it, for example, on our campus at one point in time, there's like a pretty infamous cookie in our dining hall. It's called the Rand cookie. And one year they switched the Rand cookie. We had a petition, we had riots, we had all this over the cookie. Like, that's the level of activism where these students are right now. So they are looking for something to protest and like hashtag and do things of that nature. So you got to be responsive to that. Like, and part of our job for me is like, how do we help them effectively channel, empower their own power? Like, how do we help them find and use their voice? Right. I think that's very much a part of the work that we have to do here as well. So I also think it's important that in this post-George Floyd era, when we start to think about, the current levels, yes, some of our admins may be looking more intently at what's going on at the centers, but some of them really still don't understand exactly what we do. I've had conversations with people, it's like, hey, we're thinking about launching this initiative to take on this issue. And I was like, I finally had to go to one. It's like, before y'all started launching things, check in over here and see what we're actually doing, because we've been in this lane for like 4 or 5 years doing stuff around this. But because you had a listening session and 4 people brought something up, all of a sudden, this is the new biggest issue on campus. Like, no, we've been in this lane for a while, and we've been very deliberately and consciously addressing this issue. So let's figure out how do you tap in and make sure that we're at the table, because had we been at the table to begin with, I could have told you, hey, this is what we've done already. Here's how we can use your support to help tweak or upscale what we're doing already. But part of this new focus from the admins means you can't just jump out and assume that we haven't been doing anything, because the cultural centers have been doing this work for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think that's a part of as Dr. Kadeba was mentioning, like the performance piece. Like, there are people who have actually been here doing the work, and then there are people who have been talking about doing the work. And especially for the college students on campus today, I identify as a millennial, and even I look back at my experience and I see the students today, and I'm like, students gonna be all right. They know the language. They know, they've read the books, especially when it comes to access to information. It's so much greater now. So students are coming in with a wide knowledge of the issues at hand before they even set foot on campus. So now it comes into how can we be attentive to that, and how can we actually put work and action and resources behind that, so
Yeah.
that our directors are not spending $7 across 20 different student programs. Because that's not fair to the people who are staffing these centers, and that's not fair to the students who are supposed to be getting resources, and again, community and belonging, and academic resources from these centers as well. Well, y'all already talked about this final question I have for you both before we start Q&A, but within the last few years, a series of colleges and universities have made a renewed commitment to anti-racism research and initiatives and programs on campus. Particularly, as Dr. Noble highlighted, there's the pre-George Floyd era and the post-George Floyd era. So with that in mind, how should Black cultural centers as well as multicultural centers factor that into these factor anti-racism into these commitments and strategic plans, if they are not already? Some have, and I think that some are kind of making progress on it, and there are those who have not gotten even out the gate yet. So I'd be curious to get your perspectives on that. And then as well, Dr. Noble, I would be curious to get your feedback as well in terms of how do you emphasize the value of these centers within the strategic plans and research and student programs.
That's a very good question. I think, and I'll address it kind of in two parts. I'll talk about like our role and what it should be in this anti-racism effort. I think Black cultural centers, multicultural centers, we should be highly involved on the front end, meaning as we're discussing the issues and discussing rather potential solutions or initiatives, that's where we should be engaged. I think too many times, sometimes we'll find out about some larger initiative after the horse is already out of the barn. And then we get brought to the table kind of symbolically to kind of make it look like we had a part in crafting it, when actually we didn't have any part in crafting it. We're just here as part of the advisory council now for this new initiative that's already been launched. I think it's also important that not only are we involved, but our involvement doesn't come at the compromise of our ability to do the work that we do for our communities. And what I mean by that is that sometimes what will happen is, hey, we really want you involved in X, Y, and Z, but you're not giving me any extra staff. What you've basically done is dumped an additional load of commitment on my lap, which for me to do that now, my community is going to suffer. So all of the things that make this community great or make this Black experience great, something's going to take a hit, because I'm not Superman. We can't do all things. Like, it's something, there's a relationship to where some of this you're going to start to get diminishing returns. And so I think I want our involvement to be such that, one, you make sure that our staffs are properly centered. I mean, our centers are properly staffed to ensure that we can still get the work done to take care of the people and all of the people in our community. So I think that's important. For me, when I think about the initiatives and strategic initiatives that we may launch at the institutional level, be it in the EDI lane, be it in the academic affairs lane, our centers also play a valuable role in kind of helping to speak to some of the data points. When I think about qualitative and quantitative data, our centers are very data driven. I'm a data analytics junkie. I gather information on my students. If some of them are on here, the cat's out of the bag. They're about to learn just how much information we actually gather on them. But when we talk about belonging, for example, an initiative around belonging, where I can tell you, like, because of how our center is set up, like, you got a card swipe to get in, and when you come to programs, you got a card tap. So we have numerous data points that tell us when you've engaged with us. I call those touch points. And so when I go back and I run the numbers and look, okay, who came to the center this month, who came to a program this month, and who have we not seen? At the end of the fall semester, for example, there's 239 Black freshmen at Vanderbilt. 87 of them had never come to the BCC or never come to one of our programs. We have an initiative right now where we're sending personal emails to those 87 students. Hey, just checking in to see how you're doing to make sure that you're doing okay. Would you like to get together and have lunch? I just want to get together. So that's using analytics when we talk about belonging. Because again, I want to make sure that the student is not just floating around out there and haven't found community. And we've been on campus for 4 months. Okay. We also have a system where I have the ability to When students come by, and one of our graduate students is on here, for example, I saw Amira's name. Oh, I'm sorry, this should not have said her name, but I saw one of our graduate students on here, right? We have a program to where I can look and say, okay, this student came here 10 times a week for 3 consecutive weeks, and then all of a sudden fell off to zero. That sends up a digital red flag and tells me check in with that student, make sure everything's okay. I can set that to say if they came 4 times and then went to zero, if they came 5 times then went to zero. So my staff is very intentional about trying to get in front of and catch our students as soon as we possibly can. But all of that is metric driven, it's data driven. We gather information from our students about the impact of programs and all these various things. My whole approach, and the reason why I say it's data driven is because one of my guiding philosophies is that retention to me is not the typical what we think of in terms of retention. In the university terms, retention is that did we get you from first year to graduation. Retention for me is 40 to 50 years. When you get done, when you leave this place, how do you feel about this institution? And I gotta be pouring into you while you're here. I can't wait until you get done and then tell you about, hey, think about how great it is to be a X, Y, and Z alum, yada, 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 when you didn't give a damn about me when I was there, right? And before a lot of our students on some of these PWI campuses, they kind of come and have a very marginalized experience, especially campuses that do not have a Black Culture Center, Multicultural Center. Very marginalized experience, and then the first contact that they get from the university after that is a solicitation to give money back. How would you feel about that? And so for me, I look at it from the standpoint of I want my students to see and feel my investment in their years when they're on this campus, to the point that when they graduate, it's not a difficult ask for me to say, hey, you know what, I need your help with X, Y, and Z, because they will see and feel it. And to give you an idea how I analytically track this, the class of 2021, when I first started as a director of our Black Culture Center, that was their freshman year. So that means for one class, I have 4 years of data that tells me every day that they came to that center, every program that they attended. I got 4 years of data that tell me all of that stuff about them at the BCC. We're about to have our first annual Giving Day, which is our big university solicitation for donations. I'm tracking what's the relationship between those who came to the BCC a lot in their willingness to give back, specifically to the BCC. I know it's going to be through the roof because I invested a whole lot into that class. And I think if we had that approach, and I'm not expecting to simply get them to the stage and then be done with them. No, I want to have a lifetime commitment of their willingness to come back. I have so much alumni support. The alumni support that we have is ridiculous. Financially, of their time. We just hosted a program last week called Buy Black Dandy, where it was Black-owned businesses that are student-owned, alumni-owned, faculty-owned, staff-owned. Like, I want them to see I'm not only asking you to invest in us, but we're going to invest in you as well. How do we support you? This is a win-win situation. I think too many times the institutional lens is like, how can you help us? And not how can we help you? The institution isn't doing that, but from my lane, I want to make sure we're creating this win-win situation for everybody. So when I come to you and say, hey, I got students that are hungry, you're going to quickly and easily write me a check because I've helped you. And you understand, and you were in that student spot once before. So for me, yes, data is very important. Staying data driven, staying student driven and student focused is very important. But all of that ultimately helps support university initiatives around belonging, around creating community, around giving. All these different things that we do are feeding metrics that ultimately help them look good, but it starts with us.
It's the synergy for me, honestly, truly. I mean, and to whom much is given, much is expected, right? And I think that that's the element of that. And I think that when you're truly like a family or a community unit, like you can feel that so that it doesn't feel, again, performative. Like we are all pouring into one another. Dr. Kadeba, I would love your perspective if you have anything to add as well.
Honestly, I don't know that I do, because I'm still chewing over the words that Dr. Noble shared. I love data for exactly that reason. And yes, it gets to we get to provide that to upper administration, and it fits their bottom line. But for exactly that, it arms me with the tools to be able to appropriately help and support our students. It's so crucial to what it is that we do. I really love all the examples that you share, because I think it exemplifies exactly what you shared around supporting and being invested in retention, and that retention being basically lifelong.
Yeah.
It is not about until you get your degree and and leave. And the fact that the students are able to really resonate and connect to that and come back, the students, people that have graduated, the alumni, right? Like being able to do that, it's so meaningful. So honestly, I don't even know that I have anything else to add. I'm just like, yes to all the above.
The Zoom mic has been dropped. And with that, we will begin going into our Q&A. Yes, we do see y'all in the chat. We do see y'all. We're going to get to all of these questions here. And I will go ahead and, question one. We are, we are in the space for a huge master facilities plan. We have our Latinx students that have a house that is run down and rehab is out of the question. We'd like to have a cultural center. However, our Latinx students are resistant to that. What are some approaches and thoughts that you both have to address that?
I would be curious to know, like, what are some of the reasons for why the students are resistant to that?
And
And
institution might matter as well, like the institutional characteristics might be helpful
yeah,
too.
I think there are certain dynamics that can be specific, as you mentioned, to institutions that can drive that. But I'm a firm fan and believer for you can never have enough cultural centers to me. Um, and on our campus, we recently created like a multicultural students lounge kind of space. Um, but in terms of and we have a kind of a Jewish life center. But in terms of anything that's race and ethnicity based, all we have is a Black cultural center. We don't have an Asian American cultural center. We don't have. There's a lot of other identities on our campus that don't have centers, and I
Yeah.
firmly support them having centers because I believe that I see the value and the good of what comes out of when you can harness the synergy of the Black community, right, and how it ultimately helps the overall university mission, the overall university lens, and so forth. So, for me, it would be simply a matter of like for those students who may be hesitant or resistant, understanding exactly why. And I think there was a comment put in there something about potentially undocumented students. I could understand that's a legitimate cause for concern, but for those who are not, it may simply be a matter of helping them to realize like their voice. Unfortunately, like some of our students on campus, we had a staff training with our student workers this past Sunday, and I talked to the students about how they have way more power than they realize. Like some of our minority students and minority people in general, we sometimes get a seat at the table and we adopt this like we should just be gracious to be here. I don't want to rock the boat. But understand that you got value. Like this institution is highly ranked, wouldn't be as highly ranked without your presence. And so they have a vested, and they have a vested interest. You have a responsibility to make sure that they're taking care of you. And if they're not, you need to tell the world, right? And so while you're on this campus, part of our role as admins, even in the context of a cultural center, they may not see the value in it, or they may be resistant or hesitant because one, they don't understand the true power that they have, and two, they may not understand all of the actual benefits of it. So having conversations with other places and spaces and peers that have developed these kinds of facilities can really shed light for students to understand like what's the value of it, what do you actually get out of it. That would be one of my initial responses.
And just for context, the attendee did add that it is a PWI in Iowa.
Okay.
Gotcha. But I mean, I think what you said still stands. Dr. Kadeba?
I wholeheartedly agree. The word resistance is actually what I picked up. I found myself really curious about what the resistance would be. Like, is there fear of retaliation? Is there a fear of, or is it even like demoralization in that, like, what's the point anyway? Like, it's not gonna change anything. But this idea of students being able to harness their voices and being empowered to actually demand the changes that they need to demand is so important. I'm currently having, like going through a similar process when trying to create space for our Muslim students to be able to pray. And we have two campuses, and students have a place here on one campus, but not on the other campus. And one student reached out, and part of my advocacy, well, one, I certainly escalated the concern and also connected with colleagues. And one of them invited me to the Student Leadership Council to let them know what is going on and to really solicit, again, their support around like what it is that we can do to make that change. Because the reality is, I can go on and do all the things that I need to do, and which I will do, but for student leaders to organize and come together and say that we demand to have a space for us to be able to safely practice our faith will go so far. So being able to then like dissect that a little bit and help empower them, I think would be really, really important.
Excellent. The questions are pouring in. I'm trying to get to all of them, y'all. Okay.
There was an
I
earlier one. I think you overlooked one. The first one was, how did we get the university buy-in to provide that support? I didn't want to.
yes. How do
Uh,
you, yes, well, yeah, let's come back to that one. How do you get the university buy-in? And to that point, there also was someone who asked, what role does your, because I believe this is connected, what role does your DEI or diversity officer have in your work at the Cultural Center on campus?
I think I'll speak first to buy-in. I think it's important that you got to be able to speak the language that will resonate with them. Um, Knowing what your university ultimately values and cares about, um, and but also how do they measure success? What does success look like? And so for me, it's a matter of, how do I craft the impact of the programs that we have? How do I craft the engagements and the assessments? How do I craft that in a language that speaks to what we as a university measure as benchmarks for success? Because then I'm ultimately helping the university's overall profile to look and feel more successful. Before I started, one of the areas where we were severely lacking was alumni giving from Black donors. And on annual giving day alone, we went from where on our first annual giving day we had like $900 in gifts. The first year that I was there, we jumped to $30,000. The second year, we jumped to $50,000. The third year, we jumped to almost $85,000. This year, I have a goal of $100,000. And so, again, money talks. Money talks. And when they can see that, you have the ability to galvanize your alums, and not only your alums, but your students, your current Black faculty and staff, to support the work that you're doing. That speaks to, like, the overall, the Newsweek rankings. A factor in that is giving. So the more you can get folks giving who traditionally don't give, you're helping them, right? So now how do we better support the work that you're doing, right? And not only in a giving perspective, but also in belonging. Everybody's belonging is important now. We want to put together metrics to measure and assess belonging, yada yada yada. Well, I tell some people, like, you'll get drastically different results if you send a survey versus if I send a survey.
Well, and to that point, there actually was a participant who also wanted to know, what platform do you use to track data?
I do a lot of different things, but we use AnchorLink for all of our student engagement. AnchorLink is a platform that will tell us, for example, who has come to a particular program. Outside of AnchorLink, when I started, I set our doors to where locked doors, no more just walking into the BCC. Locked doors, you got to tap the university card, ID card. I get a monthly report from the university's office that tells me everybody that tapped in and came in that building. So then I take all of that, and I have SPSS. I do a number of different things behind the scene. I've written code and syntax and all that. I'm a statistician by trade, so this is kind of give me the
Once
data.
you said SPSS, I knew what was up. I knew what was up. Okay,
give
they
me the data.
are. We're gonna have a
We
different
should talk.
conversation.
Give me the
Okay.
data files, and I can
I
get
knew what's
what I
up.
need to get out of it. So I think that's one of the, and to me though, and to follow up to that question about the second part of that, what asked about, like, the chief diversity officer. Our office this year, for the first time, actually reports up through our chief diversity officer, whereas before we used to kind of be housed more in a direct report to the provost office. And our chief diversity officer at our campus is more under the chancellors, so he's a vice chancellor of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So that person becomes like our major allied advocate for resources and things that we may need to take care of our respective identity centers, and that's kind of the role that they play. But again, on most of our campuses, I would venture to say that our spaces have existed long before we got a chief diversity officer. So that the general feel and crux of what we do, that necessarily hasn't changed. It's simply the person that we report to and the person that becomes our primary advocate for making sure that we have the resources that we need. That person has changed.
Yes.
This is all such like I feel like, I mean, I'm learning myself, right? Because I'm at a university that, like I said, does not have a precedent of having cultural centers. So this is actually something that I'm hoping to change. And one of the things that I've been doing, right, like arming myself with data, with research, I think about, like, what story am I trying to tell? And this is what I use to then craft how to then make the argument and make the case to upper administration. And the reality is, I recognize that there's plenty of things that it's going to be pulled and all of those things. And whatever it is that they end up deciding, I want to be clear from my standpoint that I did my due diligence, and I will continue to push the agenda as best as possible. And then I keep going back to this thing, like, if I put something forward and the university saying no, that something that is backed by data, by research, by best practices, right? And they yet still deny that, I have no problem. Like, let the record show that this has been brought forth, that they are aware and yet choosing to do something different. And it's not about putting on blast or anything like that, but I'm saying, if we're gonna tell a story, let's tell the whole story. Let's talk about it all. So in that sense, if I make a case, very sound case with directly how it can have positive impact on so many layers and so many of our functioning of the university, and yet you choose to not act on it, that is something that you would then have to deal with the consequence of that. And I stand behind that when I present that forth. So I think there's a certain resolve, that resolve is the word. There's a certain resolve that I hold around that, basically I like, I'm coming with the heat and like, I mean that with all my heart, and this is what I'm doing.
Yeah, sincerely.
Sincerely.
Because the data will not lie. The data reveals it all, for sure.
And to speaking to the fact that data doesn't lie, I have a meeting tomorrow morning to talk about one of the things I'm looking at now. As I mentioned, I had like 87 students who have not engaged, not for this year, but for the year before. I'm gonna look at similar students, but I want to compare GPAs for those from the first semester who did not engage versus those who did. And what I'm hoping to find is that those who engaged have significantly higher GPAs, because then that further solidifies the importance of the work that we do. Because we have tutoring services that we run out of. We got writing specialists that work out of our Black. All these are resources that we provide in our Black Cultural Center. Yeah. So if you're a student who's not been engaged, you potentially never even knew that, right? And so the data itself, and when you start speaking that language and not getting the results, I haven't found that at our case, at least our institution, I know that that's their language, and when I can put things in their language, yes, I get it.
Major key attendees: speak data, learn how to use it, visualize it, and leverage it within your own cultural centers. I know we're low on time, but I want to try to highlight two specific questions here. One of which is, in your opinion, is it important to have an integrated cultural center, or should the cultural center specifically on varying identities? And what do you think are the values of each? And this is from a participant who is at a PWI in Missouri. The other similarly related one that I definitely want to touch on is a person asked, what advice do you have for staff who are working at HBCUs who are also trying to build and incorporate a multicultural center? So I don't know if each of you want to pull to one of those, but I think that those are two ones that we should probably speak to a little bit.
Yeah, those are very good questions, and I hate to kind
of right. Which I mean, well, actually, Dr. Kadeba, I would be curious. I mean, because you're at a multicultural center, what are your thoughts and perspectives? And I think that there's pros and cons to each. I think it will inevitably depend on the organizational framework of your campus, and like even where your cultural center is based, and what is it under academic affairs, is it student affairs, like those pieces of it matter. So I would be curious to hear your thoughts.
I mean, exactly that. I was going to say, I'm going to give my favorite psychologist answer, which is it depends. And
right.
Because it does, like everything that you just said around the realities of the infrastructures that are already in play, right? Like there's things that on the logistics part of it, even like what is the physical location where it would be housed? What are some of the concerns that, like, is there like a unifying but a unifying way to bring cultures and identities and groups of students together to be able to get something off the ground? Like, is that something that administration would be more receptive for? Yeah. So that's one way of crafting the story. Would administration be more receptive of something specific, like thinking about creating a Black cultural center? It depends on so many things. And I think this is where, again, going back to learning the history of your institution, and then learning the data, what it is that you have available to yourself, and then expanded that to like whoever your sister schools may be and your aspirational schools as well, and thinking about in that comparison way, what are some ways that you can then pull all of that together to decide what would work best for your institution.
Yeah, agreed. Dr. Noble, do you, in terms of the other question regarding HBCUs, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think there will be a need for a multicultural center on the HBCU, in part, large part because, again, there's tremendous diversity in what it means to be Black. You may have international Black students. You may have Caribbean, African Black students, African American Black students. You can't. I think you do all of your students a huge injustice when you just assume that they're all the same. I've had conversations with students that will tell you culturally the African student experience, and for some of our students, they'll describe it as they're as foreign to the African American student experience as some of our white students are, because that was not a part of how they were raised. And so I think, yeah, there's still very much a need for a multicultural center, even at an HBCU, place and space where if you truly want all of your students to kind of belong, you can't take the easy way out and just assume that because they all look like they got the same various amounts of pigment in their skin or melanin in their skin, that all of a sudden they belong, just because no, you may still have to do some of that work in making sure that everybody feels included and everybody feels like they belong.
Excellent. And then I'm gonna throw in one last question. I'm gonna throw in one last one from that a participant just put in, and I think this would be a good note to close on. Is what does it look like to center Blackness unapologetically?
Our Black History Month shirts actually have Unapologetically Black on it. That is my staff shirt that we ordered.
Come on.
When you walk into our Black Cultural Center, there is no question about who that center, what center that is, what place and space that is. The art, the everything about that place and space celebrates, affirms, recognizes our student existence, our staff existence, our faculty existence. I can't tell you the number of people who are random. Like, I have Black students that do their PhD defense. They want to do it in our seminar room simply because they want to be surrounded by Blackness. I don't want to do this in my department lab that we have. I want to do this at the Black Cultural Center. We have faculty and staff that, I just had a rough day over in my little silo, and nobody over there gets me. I had to come over here, right? To center Blackness unapologetically, it is crucial and it's important to me that we never compromise that. And there's almost been like, and speaking of like, having spaces that are exclusive to a particular identity. Because I've been at Vanderbilt as long as I have, I can tell you about the conversations and the periods where, hey, maybe we should make this the Multicultural Center. And the quiet, like, mentor to mentor, director to director advice that gets passed down from one director to the next is over your dead body. Over your dead body, will you let them convert the Black Cultural Center into a Multicultural Center? Mm-hmm. We had directors, like when I was there, the guy who was there got fired over that. And so for me, that's my model, my example of like, no, this has to stay this way. And again, going back to data, the more you can start to prove that you're having the impact that you have, leave them alone, right? And so, I really believe centering Blackness unapologetically. We have Black Girl Magic photo shoots, Black Boy Joy photo shoots, where I will literally put 150 pictures on the wall, 8x10, of all of our Black female students, all of our Black male students, anybody, right? I want them to feel and see themselves in this place and space. So when you walk in, there's no question. This is a Black space. Our logo is the Africa logo with red, black, and green. It is unapologetically Black.
That's amazing.
And
yes, yes. Mic drop. Zoom link drop. And I think that is a great way to end this conversation. The Hunt Institute will be sending all participants information regarding the recording of this event, and both Dr. Kadeba and Dr. Noble will be available. I believe their information has been dropped in case any of the participants have questions. It has been a pleasure facilitating this conversation with you both. I hope it keeps going. Dr. Noble will be sending me that shirt. And thank you all again, and thank you, Hunt Institute, for allowing me to facilitate.
Thank you all so much for all of the work that you've done today, all of the gems that you have shared, and thank you to all of our panelists who have shown up. As always, we're so appreciative for the work that you all do on your campuses, and we're so appreciative for our panelists here and moderator who have shared great wisdom. We will have webinars coming up soon. There are so many that are coming up. You can find them on our webpage. And as for our Race and Ed series, our next webinar in March will feature our HBCU student body presidents. But as you look at our list, you'll see we have webinars that cover early efforts, which is our early childhood work, post-secondary pathways, our higher education and post-secondary work, homeroom, our K through 12 work, and race and ed, which is what you have experienced today. So if there's anything that we can do, please let us know. Please follow us on Twitter. Our panelists have shared their information within the chat, and you should be receiving a email and recording about this webinar. So again, thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Take care.